Well, good day, folks. Welcome back for another series in our podcast, our Discipleship Reframed series. And actually, John, it is the last one in our series. We have made it a 15-week journey now. We're coming up to the final one. It has been a long journey, hasn't it?
Yeah, I've got a handkerchief. I don't know whether to cry or whether to wave it like the final lap of a race, So, yeah.
Well, yeah, but we have made it. We thank all those that have followed along with us. Today, we have our guest with us is the senior pastor at the University Place Presbyterian Church, Aaron Stewart. Good to have you here, Aaron.
And John, you told me it's like the fourth batter in the lineup. Like, this is your best.
Yeah,
I think you vastly overrated my contribution. But thank you for having me. I'm very humbled. I'm really excited to be engaged in a conversation that I think we all need to be a part of.
Yeah. Thanks for being here, Aaron. And just to bring us all up to speed, last session was about really pulling all of these things together, and we centered on this idea of these three walls. There was a vision blueprint, there was a strategic guide, and this tactical plan that really helped us pull all the things together that we've been walking through in the Discipleship Reframed into a cohesive and coherent way of kind of putting some things down on paper, maybe some things that we might be able to walk with and to go forward with in the weeks and the months ahead. It's not meant to be rigid, but it was definitely a framework and a guide that helps us walk through. And it's going to be a work in progress. There's something to learn for all of us, and our new contexts are going to change depending on where you are and how that gets lived out. But we're all going to see kind of that same core framework, hopefully, live out in all of the places that we're in. And just to hear the stories later on about how this is all coming together is going to be awesome. But this podcast today is we're going to start wrapping things up, and there's an introduction to a second parallel reality that, John, I want you to talk about a little bit, that must be cultivated within the church and within the leader who is seeking transformation. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, I sure will try. And thank you, Brandon, for the introduction. Aaron, I remember conversations way back when you were a youth pastor, when the purpose-driven church, was the rage, and one of the things that we talked about, and I've talked to other pastors, is the danger of thinking that we can just go to a conference or a seminar or read a book and just cut and paste somebody else's method into our church. And over you hear stories of frustration or closed doors. And so that's why in the Discipleship Reframe, what we are advocating is a framework. It doesn't have all the details and the strategies, but it sets up, it's kind of an unfurnished, it's like an unfinished basement, so to speak, where you have to put in the walls and furnish it yourself. And it takes a little bit more work. So that's what we've done. And so in some ways, we're asking the pastors, as they're putting together these three walls, is then to move into the next place, which is, how do we become an interior designer? How do we think about what kind of carpet or furniture or wall hangings, etc., that will make this their own, that'll make it feel like home? So in that sense, there's these two realities that are parallel. There's the framework, for a culture of discipleship. If you think of a house like the 2x4s and maybe the wiring, the behind the scenes aspects but then there's this overall visible church culture, which is what people experience when they step into the doors, when they meet your people. And so I wanted to start with an example of two stores, and that kind of, in some ways, illustrate this real briefly. And that is Costco and Nordstrom's. And again, if you're not from the Northwest, Nordstrom's is a high-end, beautiful, clothes and quality, very quality items. And Costco, of course, is this warehouse, right? So you walk into one building, the Nordstrom's, you might have piano music, you might have very quiet ambience, with light chandeliers. You walk into Costco, good grief, there's people everywhere milling around, carts, cement floor, there's pallets, your food's above, 40 feet above. Very different cultures. Both of them, although, have a business strategy of buying and purchasing and HR and management, all that makes the store run. But what you experience as a customer when you walk in is something far different. It's the culture, and it has an immediate impact on you. So Aaron, part of what we're bringing you in to come help us explore is not the framework, for discipleship, but the overall church culture that has to give meaning and context and flesh, to any emphasis in bringing transformation into church. So I've always loved, Aaron, that, you and I feel like I just love your passion for this, what we're talking about today. I have so much to learn. And so you came in to UPPC a number of years ago as the senior pastor after being an executive pastor, youth pastor for a number of years before that. And since that time, you've instituted changes of our culture, of processes. Consultants have walked alongside of you, and things have changed at our church. So I want to tell us the story, of how did you come to understand, in a new way as senior pastor in these last years, or just the nature and the importance of church culture?
Yeah, thanks. And this has been quite a journey. And just to give people a little framework, as an insider within my tradition, maybe other traditions that's more common. And my tradition is very uncommon. I had the deck stacked against me because there's a romanticism towards the outsider that is going to come in with some silver bullets. And yet here I was, the known entity. There was no romantic honeymoon. And yet our church was experiencing a lot of dissonance between its core values, its emphasis on discipleship, and then dissonance with its very own culture. And when you say culture, people often will kind of think like, what's culture? I call culture, honestly, when you think about all of the things that you have to hold in tension. You use the word framework. I think about there's things like your infrastructure, which is usually your building or the space you're renting. Infrastructure also involves staff, but then you have other elements like the tradition you come from, and then you have things like your theological tenets and all those various aspects that we hold in tension. But then the actual process of discipleship and caring for and shaping people in the image of Jesus. Well, what we don't realize, and that the best of church consultants, and I'll save you, pastors here a ton of money. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Like, if you don't attend to your culture, it does not matter how good you are at strategic work and processes for discipleship, because your culture is the experienced real values of your church. It's the settings in which people are being shaped as much as the strategic initiatives behind them. And culture has everything to do with something we don't often try to measure or think about, which is health. That people will find very quickly if your church is healthy or unhealthy, or is just ambiguous on a number of things, which is a form of dishealth or unhealth. And so we learned that as a church, we had dissonance. Our building communicated something that violated our very own internal values. And we had to do a massive, even capital campaign. Wasn't the thing I wanted to start out with, but we had to start with a $7.2 million capital campaign.
Give us an example, Aaron. Give us an example of how the building was not in alignment with our values.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. One of our stated values as a church is that kids come first. We would say, kind of tongue in cheek, we're nuts about kids. I mean, we just are always about young children and adolescents and teenagers and their spiritual formation and blessing families in that journey. Above any other thing, our church has been shaped by that. But then you walk down into our child care spaces in some settings for our preschool or our children's ministries and youth ministry spaces, and there's mold in the rooms, or water damage in the corner because the foundation is leaking. None of the furniture had been updated in 20 years. You can say you love kids, but if your space screams, not so much, then that dissonance is felt by people the first time that they experience your building, your culture, the place that you've created. So it's not to say that we have to then dress up everything and choose kind of the Nordstrom option, but you need integrity between your stated values and your culture. So a great example, just to actually use this, John, and I'll let you ask your next question, but is that 7-Eleven one time made a just colossal error in training. They decided to train all of their managers to be a part of the Four Seasons customer service program. It's a program they offered for training of teaching people customer service. And so all these managers are learning how do they go the extra mile and offer a service to people who are coming into their business, that matches the kind of service you'd expect at a Four Seasons. Well, it failed miserably because people at 7-Eleven don't want the manager to ask them, can I offer you a bag of chips? Let's talk about, a Slurpee. People want to get in and out, and they want to do it quickly because the culture of 7-Eleven is stop and go. And whereas the culture of the Four Seasons is stay, relax, take your time. We're going to tend to every need. Well, so in that very same way, a lot of times we'll say we're this kind of church, but our felt experience, whether it be in our spaces or even just the way that people are received by members within the church, especially new folks to the church, there's dissonance there. Your culture is at dissonance with your stated values. And
right.
So culture is every healthy culture is an aligned culture, right, where your expressed or felt values are being tangibly experienced within the settings that you gather and you are shaped.
So there's alignment between the people and everything besides the people, but and this is part of the connection, isn't it? Is that discipleship framework exists there to create the opportunity for people to become more and more healthy, which is what people encounter when they come in and perceive that's their first sense of your culture.
Yeah, and I would say it's like you can have a discipleship framework, a freeway, but if you have terrible on-ramps that have all sorts of barriers and there's no way to actually get people moving, or there's just stops and starts, it's like that's where your culture often can end up being self-defeating. Yeah. And we experience that in our own church, where just some of our settings kept people from wanting to even engage. So there's a lot of facets to culture. We can talk more about what that looks like, but that's an initial, I think, kind of understanding.
Well, and you've mentioned a couple elements of church culture. Do you want to so we have building, we have traditions, we have personnel, we have, obviously there's programs or experience. You've talked a little bit about kind of the underbelly of culture too, that part of the process of our church and with consultants helping you and us was to understand underneath those visible first line experiences, there was something called a code. Yeah. And over you've highlighted this. I think it would be really helpful to share a little bit of that story and how it relates to culture.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'd say a lot of people are maybe averse to consultants. I don't know if it needs to be a consultant, or maybe you're asking some friends to come to your church and just give their observations. It doesn't need to be people that you hire necessarily, but outsiders will see the dissonance more than you will. So when you have guests over to your house, a lot of times you'll invite them over and you think the living room's cleaned up, right? You've done your work, right? But they notice the pile of newspapers next to the couch or whatever it may be, or the fact that nobody wiped down the coffee table, or is that they just notice things. So we actually had, at one point, we had what we called ghost visitors. So there are people who are asked to come and visit our church. This is in 2012. And just give us their feedback on our congregation. And had 25 people come visit our church, fill out a survey, and then they replied back to us. And every single one of them, their number one thing that they named was that in the sanctuary, there was like this Formica panel, and part of it was peeling off, and they were worried it was going to fall and hit someone. Now, we are a large church. I mean, we have, hundreds and hundreds who gather on Sundays. We have over 1,000 members. Not a single member or staff person saw it. It's so clear to them that everything was fine, but the outsiders are the ones that saw this. That's why consultants are so helpful, as they come in and see there's things that are key. So instead of thinking, gosh, it's such a warm environment, or I'm really engaging in the sermon, or what a wonderful experience in worship, and these people are so friendly, instead they're thinking, that panel's going to fall off and hit somebody on the chancel, or
not going to really listen to the sermon in that context.
Exactly, yeah. And there's just so much stuff we don't see because we're so close to it. And so when it comes to culture, there's this thing called code. It's just, think about your DNA code. And this is the gift that was given to me, was that often what many of us think we do, and it's out of our own insecurity and perhaps it's out of the way that we were trained, is we think that it's better to mimic successful churches and to copy their kind of codified way of doing ministry in church. But I would argue that every church has its unique DNA. And whether it's a church plant or it's a generational church that's been, in existence for 100 or more years, every church has something that is the reason why God intended for that church to exist. And pastors would do well to mine the stories of their congregation and their members and ask, what is it that you love? What makes you most proud of your church? Like, just tell us what that is. And it's actually a form of learning called mythologies. Okay. Like what, and if you've been a part of your church for 15 years, like what's the moment that stands out where you just felt like God was near? Or when did you feel closest to others in our church? And just generate all those stories. And what you'll find as you take the time, of course, most of us just don't take the time to do this, is you'll find that there's streams of collective values that people say, if we didn't do this, man, our church wouldn't be what it is.
Yeah. We must do this.
Yeah, we must do this, or we fail utterly in our being, right? And so getting at the juice, which is your church. Now, the problem is what we often will do is we will make the code about a pastor. And that's the American pastoral heroism phenomenon, which is just find a hero pastor who will tell us what we are or who we are. And of course, pastors will come in, they'll get grace period, and they'll do that. And then they start failing miserably because the people are like, wait a second, this isn't who we are. And it doesn't fit with what I've experienced of our church. So you'll find very quickly what those are. And then to be able to give language that really speaks to the identity of the church, not as the pastor sees it, but as the people see it.
Yeah.
And that is the felt experience people have. So one of them that we realize, we have 6 core code values. These are not aspiring values. And I've always told when I work with either businesses, consulting, or I'm working with church leaders, is if I hear the words excellence or integrity or like, I am going to, like, that's aspiring stuff. Everybody wants to be honest. Everybody wants to be, have integrity. But this has to be stuff that really characterizes your church at its best. So like one of them that came to us that was so beautiful, and it could not have been articulated unless we did the listening, was that over and over again, we heard stories where people said, I came to UPBC and my life was a mess and the church embraced me. They didn't judge me. They didn't try to quickly clean it up or dismiss me or tell me to leave. That this church just embraced my mess. And so we have a code called We Embrace Messiness. We don't take hardline stances on some things that maybe other churches would naturally do, because we believe God does the best work in the messy places. And that's where some of the most beautiful stories have happened. And so whenever someone comes into our doors, or the phrase we always say is, you either are a mess, you were a mess, or you're one dumb decision away from becoming a mess. Welcome to our church. Like, so that everybody knows is that the mess is not something to be ashamed of. It's part of the journey, and it's being able to hold that in space together with our community, that we're at our best. So that would be one core code value, that then how we do discipleship, how we do evangelism, how we do ministry is informed by that collective shared felt value. Okay?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So by the way, we didn't copy that from anybody else. That's uniquely us. In fact, no other church in all the world could say that these 6 core code values are who they are, because it's uniquely ours. And what's so beautiful about it too is it's not dependent on the pastor to keep that culture spinning. So now you think about embracing messiness, is that what did we do? We thought, you know what, we need a space that says sit, stay, share. We want it to be written into the walls that this is a place where you stay and you gather and you fellowship. And so we built a cafe. Not all churches can do this, but cafe spaces, you can do a really modest, barista stand, but it's just that idea of sitting and staying with each other and connecting in meaningful ways. That's how we then embody that value, is that stay and talk about real life and your struggles.
Right. Or maybe if people spill their coffee, that would be like a visual illustration of being messy, right, Aaron?
Yeah, in fact, you just mentioned something. At one point, there was actually like a rule that
Right.
no one could bring their coffee or their hot drinks into the sanctuary. And we're like, well, forget that. We don't care.
Right. And that's a great
The furniture is less important than people bringing in, a beverage or whatever it may be. And some people have high opinions about that, but it's just like, that was just one tangible way of us saying, no, if someone wants to bring in a drink, we're going to embrace it. And
so the value around the building now is parallel to the value of the people in the building.
Yes. In fact, I told our teams, our staff team, we once had a group of kids who were just running, around the building, and they're kicking the walls. And I go, isn't that wonderful? And then people are a little bit worked up, like, hey, calm down, kids, you better stop doing that. It's like, no. This building is going to get used up. It's going to be gobbled up. And the sooner the better. Doesn't mean that we're, letting people, vandalize it. But the point being is the building serves the culture, not the other way around.
Yeah, that's good. So tell us briefly, Aaron, just the messiness, embracing messiness. What are the other 5? I think that might be encouraging for the listeners just to hear the variety.
Yeah, each of them has kind of a background to it, but one of our convictions is we share. We are really committed. We're one of the few churches in Tacoma. I'm proud of this. I don't want to say it in a self-righteous way. We're one of the few churches in Tacoma that gives radical giving away. We have well over 20% of our giving goes towards partner ministries that do ministry better than we could. We have a cooperative in Meru, Kenya that's graduated over 500 students. We share is like, if UPC were ever to like stop supporting ministries in our local region, our people would be bothered by that. Like UPC is a place that wants to invest into all sorts of arenas in the city. And another one is we're big on artistic expression. We have a Music and Arts Institute that developed out of that. I shared that we love kids. We are in the highs and lows of life together. That's a facet, kind of embrace the messiness, but more of like we're in the whole game of when life is at its worst, but also when it's at its best. We do this together, and togetherness is a big shared value. We create room is a little distinctive for a Presbyterian church in that we create Holy Spirit moments of healing or transformation. So several years ago, people remember we helped by putting on a vigil for the police officer in the East Tacoma, Officer Rodriguez, that was killed and brutally. And we had a vigil on the east side, and prayer room experiences. We often do on Holy Week, we'll do Stations of the Cross experiences, but we want to create room for the Holy Spirit to do unique things. And some of those powerful moments have always been part of our DNA and our history. So yeah. So
no, that's good. Aaron, as you're talking, I'm thinking about, this, that what you're talking about at a church level, I think we experience at a personal level. Like I think about, I married somebody who didn't naturally follow the pattern that you connect with God through the Bible first and foremost, and so she had to try to fit that mold. That was the ideal. That was what I should do. But when we were able to get in touch with her love for nature, or her, and say that's who you authentically are, and live out of it, it's kind of a personal culture, if you want to say that, that's her code, then she comes alive and she's authentic. And I think we all know that that's true for us individually, and we've experienced that. But you're saying that's true for a body, right? And to take that seriously, otherwise we live under the should of the ideals, or we live in disintegrous lives.
Well, and that's where there's two resources that I really strongly urge people to look at. One is a secular resource, but is a brilliant thinking that is so helpful for pastors. It's by Patrick Lencioni. It's called The Advantage. And it's the subtitle of it is Why Organizational Health Trumps Everything Else. And really what he could say is why cultural health trumps everything else. And in one of the quotes, I remember I repeat it all the time. Organizational health is the single greatest advantage to any organization, any church today. But too many leaders, too many pastors think it is beneath them, not measurable enough, not complex enough. But it's your culture that is the incubator for discipleship and fellowship. And so it's a little bit like we think of our own homes. In fact, the second resource I'd say is Edwin Freeman, who's the godfather of what's called family systems. is he wrote a book called Generation to Generation about faith communities. And one of the things he gets at is that just think about your own family and the culture that your home was. And there's certain things that, you have a cultural code by default or design, you decide.
Mm-hmm.
And most of us have just done the default thing. And that means that some people kind of have to guess at it. They don't quite know what it is. Like one of the defaults for my family was when dad comes home from work, give him 20 minutes to read the paper and, be alone. Right. But there's other things too. Is like the Stewart family laughs. We tell stories and we laugh. Every dinner gathering we have, at some point we're laughing about something. And that was part of our code. Right. But you have a code by default or design. So why not design it around the unique story of your church? And that's what makes you healthy, is to direct then the energy around you are at your best when you are fulfilling your code. So I often say to people who are fixated on mission statements, I just ask, like, did your family have a mission statement? Mission statements can be good, but I would actually say that your family actually had a code. And whether they articulated it or not, you lived it and you experienced it, and you want to share it with your own children at times. So the best of your family. Obviously have the things we don't like, but family systems is something we realize and experience in our own homes. And it is the exact same thing. As Edwin Friedman would say, it doesn't matter from a Fortune 500 company down to a small, 4 or 5 person business or small group or family. Everybody behaves in predictable patterns because human beings make up every organization.
Right.
So it is so true of churches. And when I work with leaders, especially church leaders, is to help them understand how to anticipate those patterns, especially when they're leading change, and let their code be their bulwark. I mean, just that anchor as they maneuver change. And as long as you don't violate your code, you can lead much more change than you think you can. And people will be amenable to that. So
that's good. I think in a little bit here of in my own family, I inherited a culture, and then my wife and we tried to create a culture. And so there's this tension. There's this, like I say, there's the framework, the 2x4s, and then there's the wall and the paint, and they're really one, but we're talking about them a little bit separately here. And so somebody at some point at every church developed patterns and strategies and put that were authentic to them, that became part of the culture. So there's this chicken and the egg thing between culture as a whole, what you experience when you're in the room, so to speak, but also what's behind it.
Yeah.
What continues to nurture.
This is why every pastor at some level is jealous of church planters, because you get to come in and just, but then I talked to a church planter once, and he was so winsome, and he just said, I'm 10 years into my church and I realized all the problems are the ones I created. I wish I had somebody I could blame it on.
No, but either way, Aaron, you think about it, a lot of times when we think of pastors as shepherds and teachers as the dominant images, that is not culture creators. That's, and so part of the challenge here is we're trying to connect this, what we've been doing with the Discipleship Reframed for these last 14 sessions and coming to a close here is in some ways say, don't try to get a formula, but to do the work of the interior design so that whatever ends up showing up in your church looks like the culture. It feels like the culture that you would have. So you and I talked yesterday about, so if you do kids really well, right? And that's what the passion is. And part of discipleship is to move people from experiencing something to them finding their niche on teams and giving it away. Then youth ministry, VBSs, those become central parts of your interior design, with the framework behind that is, how do you move people forward? How do you help them find their gifts as they grow, blah, blah, so.
Well, I know that, but John, this is the one of the key aspects of developing and articulating your code, which is the culture that you want to embody, the felt experience. One of the key aspects is it helps you say what you need to say no to.
Yes.
Because the question that I always have, we have my staff here, our ministers or pastors come, hey, I have an idea for a new partnership or a new ministry or whatever. And I'm like, I just say, help me see how this helps fulfill our code and create resonance and integrity with the code we have. And if they can convince me, I'm like, let's do it. And if we have the resources and people power and the whole bit. But if they can't, then I'm like, I just don't So for instance, as a church, we've always just said singles ministry just isn't our thing. We're a family church. We feel like singles is sometimes has a negative connotation. I know other churches that do singles ministry so well, and that's great. We've said no to it because just don't feel like it's something that jives very well with who we are as a church.
No,
So that would be like an example of of helping. What your culture and your code does is it helps you also know what to say no to,
right.
and to be directed and focused. And healthy organizations, this is what Lencioni says in his book. He kind of tongue in cheek, there's 4 things you must do to be a healthy church. 1, create clarity. 2, reinforce clarity. 3, make sure you have a cohesive team, because every team needs that. And then 4th is reinforce clarity again.
Yeah.
It's all about clarity. Is who are we? How does everything from our building to our fellowship to the way that we talk to each other, how does it reinforce the culture that we believe? And of course, so much of that is the Jesus way, right?
Yeah, well, I think that's well said. In some ways, we have spent a lot of effort to look at the life of Jesus and to draw from him aspects of a method, aspects of priorities that helped move people from A to B to becoming more like him. But what we can't do for people is, we can't tell you what color paint to put on your walls, right? We can't, in that sense of what that looks like. So you have on the one hand, the enduring example of Jesus that's a guide of how you're going to go forward. But then you have to know yourself. And so this is part of the challenge for those who have walked through the DR experiences. You get to the end of this and it kind of opens up, it's like climbing a mountain. You thought it was the top, but the summit's actually another 2,000 feet. In other words, there is this work of knowing, discovering, cultivating, and making clear to all what your culture is. And once you do that, then you have the framework and the interior design, so that if you're trying to create an antique look, retro furniture from the 70s, you'll just know that doesn't fit because you know who you are.
Yeah.
I'm wondering.
What would be fascinating, John, too, at some point, I think you'd love this, and maybe the listeners would be too, is read the gospel through a different lens. Watch what Jesus was doing to create a culture amongst the disciples that was ultimately what created the culture of the first church. So one of the cultural values was holding loosely things and possessions, so much so that the first church could share radically in a way that's so un-American, right? And against consumerist mentalities, right? Yeah. But just thinking about what were the codified? Of course, he was teaching a strategy of discipleship, and all those things matter. But the felt experience the disciples had,
day by day, trusting other people to support them. Yep. That was reinforcing the teaching, and then so when they gave away their possessions in the early church, they weren't saying what should we do. It's who they were, and that's. So now would you have a final word of encouragement or a warning or exhortation for those who have kind of walked through these 14 sessions? They've been digging deep into what it means to have a framework for a culture of discipleship, and now we've shared today. Anything that you would want to say beyond the good things that you said, and kind of a final encouragement or warning?
I think the biggest encouragement I could give, and it's just out of empathy and someone who's failed miserably at the mimicking game, even looking at other churches and successful churches and saying, how are they teaching? What kind of series are they doing? How they're engaging? That's all well and good. And you can, kind of learn by watching other learners. But at the end of the day, the secret sauce is you.
Being yourself.
Being yourself. Being the you that God called to that setting. And then mining the gift that is your people, their experiences, the history of the church that you're coming into, honoring that history and that past as much as you can, and to be true to your calling, your setting, the culture that's already there, but just has yet to be really unearthed and refined. And so it's like rough gemstones, and once you put them in the hands of your leadership, that they can polish off the rough edges, is all of a sudden you have these gems that just are so valuable and are so helpful to your church and where you're headed. And that's where when then you're cooking with gas when the framework stuff starts to combine with that.
Right. Yeah.
Is your strategies aren't being defeated by a poor or unhealthy culture or toxic culture.
Yep.
And this is what I'll say, that this is the most encouraging thing for pastors, because we pastors all know that there's just stinky sheep. You know, they bite at you, and they're just not like, God, can't you just send them to another congregation, you know, kind of thing. Is that healthy culture always weeds out the dysfunctional people.
That's good news.
Because they don't have power. They don't have enough power to fight back against the tidal wave that is your distinct culture and identity. And they'll get frustrated, and ultimately they'll either leave or they'll conform to the health. But a healthy culture, just like a culture eats strategy for breakfast, it also eats conflict. It weeds through the conflict and pierces it. And that's been one of the strongest gifts we've experienced, and I would preach and share with others is that be you, and be attentive to the unique identity God's given you and your church. And it is a gift.
Yeah, that's good. You know, Brandon, as Aaron's been sharing, I know we're wrapping up here, but I'm thinking about just the kingdom story value of the scripture story in one hand, you know, and our story in the other. You know, Karl Barth said the newspaper, you know, the culture story, but our story, when those two stories come together, the framework is the Jesus story, really looking at what he did, but then combining it with really knowing our story, which is what we do in our scripture study. It's the same thing here, isn't it? I mean, and when those two connect, there's authenticity, there's power, and the juice of the Holy Spirit. So just inviting those who are listening to this journey, wherever you are. Some of you are well down the way. This was very affirming. Others of you may find this a challenge and a road ahead. And one of the things, Aaron, I wanted you to maybe say something at the end, is that we Kingdom Story wants to offer to those who have been in the discipleship framed experience a chance to get some more time with Aaron. And I've asked, I know you're doing this consulting and some of these seminars with other leaders already, Aaron. Do you want to just say something about maybe what you might be able to offer those who would be interested in a kind of an extended experience on this culture of church stuff?
Yeah, my side passion and work that I see in the future is working with pastors and leaders of small to large organizations, helping them get clarity on their own organizational identity, but also how to manage people to flourish, especially when it comes to staffing systems. And so, my passion is to bless pastors, and I spent a lot of years fumbling and stumbling, and but once I was trained, I'm a trained consultant in this arena of family systems and training leaders, is that to help them see. And once you see, your leadership impact, it just grows exponentially. And so I'd love to offer that. We could do it in some in-person settings with pastors, and I'd love to do that for free, because it's just something I have a passion for in the kingdom of God, and then see where that leads. But I'd love to offer it. And it's one of those things where, like, I've had so many settings where you're invited to stuff and it's like, it was okay. I've just never had anybody come out of some of that stuff going, no, this is a game changer. Yeah. And the more that they put energy into it, they realize that it's it's compounding in its impact, to the point where there's so much now happening in my church that I don't even have an idea of how it's happening, or it's organically happening because the culture is so healthy. And to share about how that can come about in a relatively short period of time, John. I mean, as you well know, it was a 5-year change.
Right.
And from a dying preschool with a terrible facility to the largest private preschool in the state. Right. I mean, just that sort of exponential growth just doesn't happen in very many places. And a church that was obsessed with 1 or 2 hours on Sunday, and now is a 7-day-a-week church. We have more people in our building on the weekdays, on an individual weekday, than we do on Sunday mornings.
Right.
And that's a post-Christum change that has to happen in a lot of our settings, is the church has to become relevant, Sunday through Saturday, not just Sunday. And then we release, is that we can be a culture and a setting that really is empowering all throughout the week.
Good. Well, Aaron, a couple of things. It's been a pleasure, not only here on this podcast, but also to be working with you at our church over the years, intersecting this commitment to a culture of discipleship with knowing our culture and living through it, and to be a part of it. So it's just a gift to have you. And for those listening, We will be offering and making known some very real, tangible opportunities in the weeks and months ahead to be with Aaron again. If you would so choose, highly recommend it. In some ways, all this work that we've done, we're recognizing that if we don't add the yin with the yang, if you don't put this stuff there,
That's right.
if they don't do together, everything that we've done so far will not have the fizz of the pop. So highly recommend that you take advantage of that. Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, thank you, brother.
Yeah, well, Aaron, it's been a pleasure listening to you and having you share all of that about culture. It's definitely, I hope, given some real hope to the pastors and realizing that there's not this huge culture that I need to learn and figure out how to grab and bring in. I just need to get in touch with who I am. And the more that I know who I am, which is just the way the gospel story works, right? The more I know who I am, the more of God I can access. And in that place, I can lead my church down a way that creates disciples that follow after Jesus. And so, yeah, I thank you for all the insight that you have. And I highly encourage all of us to reach out to Aaron if we can to lay hold of this, the wisdom that he has, and to see how that might integrate into all of our spaces. So again,
you might even be willing to share this with one of your church leaders, this podcast. I mean, just kind of spread the wealth, because ideally you wouldn't just come alone to a time with Aaron. Maybe you bring your whole church team. So feel free to share this.
Yep. And to remember that we're all three of us are just a bunch of disciples trying to figure our way down this road together. So we give the best that we can with what we have, and we offer it up to God in humility. So we thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.